With that said, my name's Jake. My name tag says Jacob, but that's only when I'm in trouble. I'm a platform consultant here at Hivebrite, and today I have the pleasure of sharing the virtual stage with Nikki and Sierra. Nikki founded the community, which, no, I did not stutter. It is just as meta as it sounds. It's a space for senior community professionals to come together, kind of like in this space right now. Community can be a little bit siloed, so really, really novel concept there. And then on the other hand, Sierra runs the community at Blue Star Families. I've actually personally had the pleasure of working with Sierra in a past life as a client success manager, doing some really impressive work around supporting military families and veterans. So with that said, we've already had some pretty interesting conversations just while preparing for today. I'm excited to jump back into the discussion with y'all, and I figure we can probably kick things off with that. Thank you for being here today, Nikki and Sierra. Quick note for the audience, again, we can submit any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many as we can during the session, but we will follow up afterwards if we're not able to get around to anything. So, with that said, figure we'll kick things off with probably the defining question around niche communities, what a niche community is. How do you define your community without making it too broad or too small? Making sure that you're not drawing the line in, say, an arbitrary or unnecessary space, not limiting yourself, but also making sure the conversation stays relevant. Sierra, I feel like in the Blue Star community especially, you guys have a lot of overlapping personas. I'd love to understand when we're talking about the U.S. military, massive, massive organization, is that still niche in your mind? I mean, how do you kind of define your audience?
Thanks, Jake. That's a great question, honestly. And from our perspective, defining your community is really about identifying that intersection between your own expertise and then a real shared need among the group of people, right? And so when we were going into it, we knew we didn't want to make it too broad. And so we started by asking questions like, who are we best equipped to help? And what unique perspective or value can we offer them? And so during the process, we really kind of started brainstorming sessions to determine like who we're serving and how we can best support them in an online community. We asked questions to make sure that things weren't too broad, because if it's too broad, then anyone can belong. And if they're too small, then you're not going to really reach anyone either. So it ended up culminating in 4 different persona groups for us, where people could self-identify, join in, and then really help to create that sense of belonging that we're all looking for.
Do you have any signals that you'll rely on to tell you, okay, we've got these 4 personas, but are they valid? Is it working? What sort of, checks do you have in place, if any?
Yeah, we worked with our membership to really decide like what personas we were going to focus on, and for us that became our active duty service members, their military families, and then our veteran and veteran family population, along with our everyday Americans who are our civilian supporters.
Love it. Nikki, is there anything that you want to add from the community standpoint, or any thoughts on kind of in general defining that audience, finding the sweet spot?
Yeah, honestly, Sierra hit the nail on the head with talking to your members. It's even if you're starting from absolutely zero, it's important to reach out to those who you think would be prospective members. So, for example, when I started the community, which I'll now say TCC because it's so much easier, I went out to about 13 of the people who I would have loved to have in the community, and just asked them what it is that they needed, what would it look like to gather the similar personas. I definitely had a little bit of a leg up because I was interviewing community professionals, so really a lot of helpful insight there. But Sierra hit the nail on the head. You really have to just understand what your value proposition is, and honestly what your value proposition isn't, to be able to build the right thing.
I always try to ask myself, like, if this community disappeared tomorrow, what would the members miss? And I think that can be a really good guiding light question to, better understand what's driving the incentive. Why are people coming here in the first place? And that probably leads into my second question for y'all, which is really, how do you make that case for quality of end users over just, a raw, hey, we've activated 200 people last week, pats on the back, even if maybe they're not necessarily adding to that quality environment that you're trying to curate. And it's easy to get bogged down in the raw metrics, but how do you kind of shift that mindset really to more fit overall engagement as opposed to just total number of activated users, which, is easier to look at, but maybe not as telling?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in the community profession is how many members you have. And it's because I want to acknowledge that data is kind of hard to come by. It's not really like the gold standard to measure your members, because that's not really the value you're trying to drive. You're not trying to create a room full of a lot of people. It's what the people do in that room, and what the outcome is that you're really trying to measure. And so with a grain of salt, like, it's sometimes not easy to measure this out of the gate, but if you can have the conversations with leadership early, that you're not just trying to gather people to have a good time, there's an actual goal at the end of it, and you'd like to be able to measure those signals. So maybe it's product adoption. Like, you can look and see, are the people in my community adopting more more of our product than those who aren't in the community? And so the conversations with leadership are often more so around, let me drive value for the business. And driving value for the business doesn't mean having a certain number of folks in there. We can do a lot with a little.
Love it. Sarah, is there anything that you want to add as far as just more generally speaking, kind of the quality of members and bringing the right people into the community?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with Nikki that we can do a lot with a little. And you don't want to just have a large number that isn't actually contributing. If people aren't finding value in being there, they're not going to come back. And so really having, resources, the support that whomever your community is looking for is what's needed, because you want to give practical tips and connections in that online atmosphere that also create relationships outside of the community.
And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that everybody's engaging every day, right? Like, you can have very meaningful communities where maybe 90% of your personas are, I used to call them lurkers, maybe now we call them learners. But if they're still getting value, they're still coming back, maybe they're not actively contributing to conversations, but there's still that opportunity to broaden the engagement with them, and they're still valuable members to have in the community. On the flip side, I'm curious, how do you actually screen out maybe the wrong members from your community? Or is there any tactics that you might be able to employ that, well, say maybe take some of that off your plate, where you're just better communicating, better reaching the people who your community is relevant to, while maybe avoiding those more problematic personas? And I'm curious, have you even had problematic personas in your community? How do you manage that, generally speaking?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, Jake. I think attracting the right members is really less about gatekeeping and more about setting clear, intentional communications. For us, the best communities naturally attract people that they're built for, because we're really trying to be explicit about our values, our purpose, and why they want to be there. So we really try to be mindful in our messaging and speak directly to the experiences, aspirations, and challenges that our ideal members are experiencing. We use language and visuals and examples that are going to resonate with them. And I think it's really important to name who the community is for, and also maybe who it isn't for. Because when people can see themselves in your narrative, I think they're more likely to join and participate. And if they don't see themselves there, then they'll often self-select out of it. So we really use our onboarding process to create an experience that reinforces the culture that we have, the expectations that we are looking for in the community, and invite new members to, share and engage in the different topics that we currently have going on.
I often say that it's not a Nikki. You haven't spent time with me, but I haven't said clear as kind, and that's exactly like how it boils down, Sierra. Like being really clear about what the value is really helps someone self-select into the experience. One thing that can happen though is like from my experience building community internally in an organization through like a women's employee resource group. When I was at Shopify, we were starting to gather more folks who were just not male. So those who are non-binary or transgender were coming into the women's ERG because that was a comfortable space, or we were touching on topics that maybe pertain to their life. But we had to get really clear about, are we an employee resource group for those who aren't women? And so I think like being really clear about the value that they'll get and who you're creating content for does allow people to like self-select into the experience. And then you're not disappointing people who aren't finding what they need.
So it's not even really a matter of like, sure, bad actors are folks that obviously we want to keep out of our community, but even just providing that little breadcrumb trail to sort of give people the idea, is this the right place for you? Is it not? And maybe gently guiding them from there. But I think that leading with kindness is always the right approach, right? Because you never know when you might want to expand the community to include additional groups, and you don't necessarily want to put people at odds with what you're trying to do either. I guess more generally speaking, so that definitely helps us narrow the scope, understand how are we really getting the right people into the community. And to your point, Nikki, we can do a lot with a little, but at some point, it does make sense to start scaling a community, ramping up, getting more people involved so you can have a bigger footprint, you can make more of an impact, and you can really bring together a larger cohort of like-minded folks. Once you've already set these parameters around who do we want in our community, how are we actually vetting out who comes in and maybe who we partition out for now? Once we've set those baselines, how do we really efficiently scale from there? And, are there any common strategies that you would either encourage or maybe avoid if there's anything, if you want to protect what you've already established within your community?
Such a great question, Jake. I think scaling a niche community successfully really means expanding your impact without diluting the culture that you're looking to create. The most effective tactics that I've kind of found focus on deepening member engagement and really empowering that kind of organic growth rather than just chasing those large numbers. And so, some of the things that have worked for us are really fostering leadership from within. So our active members, the ones who are, those early adapters, kind of communicating, posting, sharing things, we try to encourage them to almost take on volunteer roles within specific groups to kind of keep the community's voice authentic and really grounded in value, but not just having employees who are sharing, resources and that sort of thing. Also, as we've grown these communities, we've created kind of subgroups to allow for different topic and location-based connections to be built. We try to prioritize quality over quantity, and so everything from our events to our weekly content is centered around serving our core audience, even as we grow.
I love. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to chime in because I love the idea of identifying these sort of community leaders, right? And I think that is a really natural, organic way of saying, you've been here a long time, you know what makes the community tick, and now champion that.
Yeah.
Curious from your perspective, one, how do you identify those folks? And two, would you say, is there sort of is gestation period the right word? Is there a certain amount of time where it's okay, so and so has been in the community for 6 months, and we think we're starting to identify a pattern. We think we see that they're, a viable community champion. Does it vary from person to person? I know that's something a lot of communities struggle with in terms of how do identify how do we identify champions and folks who can really further our community message. So what's your experience been like in that regard?
Yeah. So our community has been established for just over 2 years now. And our organization has been around since 2009, so much longer. We definitely have champions who were here long before our online platform was created. And so they were people that we partnered with from the beginning to try to get in there and be a voice for different either branches of service, different lifestyle opportunities, and different interest groups. As we've gotten more established within this last year, I would say, you're able to kind of see more of who's really engaging just on their own and naturally, and you can start to identify people in that way. But I would say, like, from the beginning, it's going to probably be people that you have known outside of this community that you're trying to explain the need for, why you're creating this, and how they can be a great voice of opportunity within there and share their life experiences.
I think on the flip side of that, I just recently joined Stripe, and our community is built on Stripe Community Builders, which are Stripe power users and volunteers. And because we're just starting out and we're starting out with that model, we didn't have a community to pull from in order to find those champions for those subgroups. And I think, like, one of the things you can do when you're first starting out is to create a hypothesis of, like, what type of person would be really good as a community leader. Like, as community leaders ourselves, I think we can trust our instincts a little to understand, okay, what are some of the things that would be a good value to our community that we're trying to build, but then also, like, are we offering something to those community leaders to take on little niche communities within our greater community. And so if you can say yes to, we're creating value, and that there's, like, a win-win there, then it's okay to kind of take a little bit of a risk on someone that you literally do not know. And because I think, like, we all have to start somewhere, and it's okay to start from a place where you're building with potential members instead of actual members.
Yeah.
I mean, I would even argue that maybe there's virtue to that, right? In the sense where, let's say we do take the idea of, like, we know who our core contributors are and we lean into them, and let's extrapolate that where, we've got a bunch of like-minded people guiding this community. On the surface, that sounds great, but, does that create the risk of maybe having our focused community turn into more of an echo chamber, or even becoming a little stale in terms of programming when everybody's sort of parroting the same talking points and is on the same page? I don't want to say does it make sense to introduce conflict, but is there anything that community managers need to watch for in terms of evolving the conversation, making sure that it stays respectful while still moving in a positive direction, keeping things fresh? That can always be a bit of a challenge, especially with later stage communities. I'm curious, Nikki, especially in your case, how have you kind of kept that going in terms of, if you have the same people talking, making sure that you are bringing in additional voices as well?
Yeah, honestly, when I first started the community, you pull from your network. Like, you're just naturally going to have people who come in from, people people who know the people and that's kind of can be a little homogenous. So, for example, we have a strong contingent of, like, tech community builders. And so we had very few niche community builders like gaming. or nonprofit. And so while the community tactics are the same-ish, there are nuances within those spaces. But one thing that happened as a result is that we started getting the same people talking. And what we did early when we launched was we had a quarterly survey. Now, I think for established communities, quarterly is a little too much. But when you're first starting out, the more signals you can get from your community, the better. And so in those surveys, one thing, I made a hypothesis that was wrong, that community builders would inherently know that they are welcome to participate in a community. But what we were finding in our community community survey results was that community builders were coming into this space and they were seeing the same people talking, and they felt like there was kind of a clique going on, or that their voice didn't necessarily belong or wouldn't necessarily be welcomed. And so, shocking to me, because I was like, wow, I thought we all understood that if you're a part of the community, you belong here. And so what we had to do was we had to bring in new voices that were not as homogenous, and do that intentionally. So we have like an application-based community, and so I would go out and I would research folks who were from different industries and have them apply to come in. And then the second is encouraging people to participate once they are in. And so that can be just like a DM from me saying, hey, I've noticed that you haven't chimed in. I wanted to know if you felt comfortable. And it's also the third thing we did was create really low stakes environments for participation. So we created this thing called Happy Hour, and it's a time when we're all online, and we have very non-professional questions. So it's like things about what you're doing that week, or your favorite foods, or a story from your childhood. We have a channel called Happy Hour where once a week we all come in and we're chatting together. And so it gave people the ability to participate and not feel like there's this high stakes of, I need to be really smart. These are my peers in the industry. And they were able to get their foot in the door of building relationships outside of the professional persona.
And it changes the tone of the conversation, right? Where like obviously you don't want your entire community to turn into what are you doing this weekend community, but to have those little palate cleansers can really go a long way. Sarah, I know your community is probably a little different in terms of scale when we're talking about Blue Star families, right? So, maybe it's not the same nature of issue, but especially when you've got Army, Navy, Air Force, and maybe all these more kind of almost sub-communities, I think the same question applies, right? Where how do you make sure that, whether at a global level or a more niche group level, how do you keep that conversation fresh and make sure that, the conversation is evolving and people are still able to get resources they need in new and novel ways? I'm curious if you have any feedback there.
Yeah, that's great. And I just love the feedback loop that you use, Nikki, because I think it's so important. It really just helps you, stay relevant and make sure you're meeting the member need, and hearing, what they would like to have. So I definitely try to keep those lines of communication open, despite it being a very large online platform at this point. Similar to Nikki, inviting diverse viewpoints, having those new voices. We do have smaller subgroups, as you mentioned, like for our branch groups or interest groups. We have career learning paths. And so really trying to get those champion voices in there who are just sharing about their real lived experiences, so that people can then feel led to just share either, what they're struggling or what their wins are, something new that they're learning. Just trying to stay connected to member needs is really my ultimate goal. I'm always trying to just foster a culture of openness and continuous improvement within the neighborhood. Inviting, fresh perspectives and just ensuring that people feel seen and just known, despite it being a large platform and lots of different faces in there. Like, you matter, and we're so glad that you're here and you are a valuable member, because they might not always hear that in their day to day.
It's a great shout.
Sierra, do you do that through like onboarding? Like, is that you do that right away? Like, how do you make them feel seen and heard?
So we do that through onboarding, I would say. Yes, we have different touch points over the course of 4 weeks of emails that we do send, which kind of ties into automation processes. We don't want everything to be automated, because then I feel like you just kind of lose that personal touch if it's over automated, but really just trying to make sure from the beginning they know, like, we are so happy you're here, like, these are different opportunities for you here, making sure they know where to find either the subgroups or their local events or virtual events that might be of interest. Just kind of, re-emphasizing, like, you can learn how to go through the neighborhood on this journey right here, and we want people to have as easy access to learning and growth, both personally where they are and also online, because as military families, you can move every 2 to 3 years, and so you're often having to restart and build new connections. And so my main goal is that no matter where military life takes you, like, you are not alone, and we are here for you. And personally, if I don't have the answer, like, I will help you find it, because that's sometimes just what you need.
And it's such a meaningful community mission, right? Where it's like, I don't think anyone on this call would be able to poke holes in the value of something like Blue Star Families, but there are also more nebulous community use cases out there. And not to sidetrack us, but I saw one question come through kind of asking about, like, okay, if community has veered off from its original purpose, or if maybe it's even just kind of unclear from the start, what does course correcting look like there, or how do we evaluate the actual original intent of the community? And I honestly feel like we've already answered that to an extent, because to your points, feedback loop is so important, and you can look at the metrics all day, but unless you're actually hearing it from the horse's mouth, getting surveys from the community, hearing people, boots on the ground, like, are you getting what you need from us? That feels like the most impactful way of gauging, are we on the right track? Do we have that niche appeal that we're looking for? But would either of you add anything to that, as far as, how do we make sure that we're barking up the right tree and that we are really addressing the needs of this niche?
Yeah, when I read Hannah's question, I actually 3 years ago I started at a new company, and when I came in, the community was very upset with the company. And when I did some investigation into, like, why is the community so upset with the company? Like, what are we doing? What have we been doing? And it was the lack of clear expectation of what the community was for. And so, because without that, the community made up what the community was for. It made some assumptions, and we weren't fulfilling them because we didn't know them. And so one of the things it feels hard, because you're going to lose people when you reset expectations, but just being really sure that in the long run it's better for everyone, the community members, the community itself, the business, if you do reset the expectations and create that clear narrative. So, and I think you answered your own question of, like, is it that it's with better comms? And yeah, it is with better comms.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it goes right back to what you said, Nikki, about how clear is always kind, and I think when people know what to expect, then it just helps them to determine, like, oh yeah, I definitely want to be here, or wait, this isn't for me, and there's nothing wrong with that, because there's another place that will be for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, to that point, as far as, kind of finding the space for you, and Sierra, I think this is probably a question that's particularly tailored to the Blue Star community. But when you do have a community that's grown so much, in terms of volume, that you start to partition it out into maybe more focused sub communities, like we were talking about with Army, Navy, Air Force, so on and so forth, things can get pretty complicated. Um, you're still managing a global level community. You've still got a brand that you're trying to put out there. How do you structure things and ensure that you've got tight enough governance throughout these more niche sub communities while still maintaining overall ownership of the broader platform, the messaging, the direction of the community, while letting those sub niches kind of still do their things and have their own personality? Um,
Yeah.
I know there's some pretty significant differences between those military branches, right? So that's probably an interesting challenge.
Definitely. Yes. um, and honestly, it's a lot of work. Each community, really does need its own clear purpose and norms so that people know what to expect. Um, it it can be overwhelming if you look at it too broadly, and I definitely am a list maker, so I love being able to write things out and like what are we doing it here and narrow it down. So we offer, several different groups that you've already mentioned, Jake. We have interest-based groups, so these even tie into just like reading and cooking and that sort of thing. Meal planning for when you're having to live in a hotel room for 2 months while you wait for, your real housing to come. So really, each of these groups kind of has its set norms, its purpose, and distinct identity, And so as much as it ties into our larger programming and our mission, we also, want them to have their voice and be tailored to a specific audience within that realm. Like I've mentioned in the past, we've tried to empower leadership amongst like different members and people who are coming in to moderate, to just kind of nurture the space and uphold the values and just listen to members. Having that kind of clear framework and just established guidelines so that people know what to expect and what they can do there. And then still having our larger groups, like our 4 persona groups, where we create moments for like cross community engagement and share our networking events, those shared resources, just really kind of help to have not like a one size fits all approach, but support each community distinctly and give it what it needs to flourish, while maintaining like the heart of what Blue Star Families is for and the vision that we have for our organization.
Nikki, I'd love to give you a chance to add your thoughts as well, but I'm also seeing a question that came in as far as, for communities that start too broad and want to become more focused,
Mm-hmm.
how do we go about that? And Sierra, I feel like you really maybe inadvertently kind of hit the nail on the head there, right? As far as like, let's hear from the community and understand where are the disparate needs.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there are common threads across the entire broad community where you can say, you know what, yes, this will be hosted at the global level. This is evergreen content that's relevant to everyone. And then maybe at the same time, you notice some conversations that are happening at the global level or in groups where it's like, wow, this is a great conversation. It's meaningful, but it's not really relevant to a vast majority of the people here. And identifying where it's, this is a thread that we want to pursue, but maybe not at the right place. I feel like that's always a good impetus for firing up maybe smaller sub communities within a more broader interest community. But I don't mean to hijack. Nikki, if you have any thoughts on you know really managing more niche communities or even just kind of helping to define a more narrow view for a community, I'd love to get your 2 cents there.
Yeah, two thoughts on the like managing multiple niche communities under one roof. It's important to understand what you want the outcome to be. So, for example, at Stripe, we don't have a community level. We don't have one. We don't have the Stripe community. We have only niche communities. And so what's interesting about that is that you have to figure out, okay, what is the value, what is the through line, so that if someone were to join the motorsports community, would they have the same experience when they join the community in Bogota.
Mm.
And so for us, our through line is events. It's an event-driven experience. And so we help our community builders to host events either online or in person. And we know that we want the signal at the end to be that CSAT score. And so we can understand that the people who are attending those events are they having a good time? Are they getting the content that they need? And then really our niche communities can take whatever form they want. There's one that's about floral design. And that person is really interested and passionate about floral design. And so you wouldn't get that from Stripe as like a company, but because this Stripe user their business is in floral design, they're able to create a community about that. And so I think that's this is the first time I've seen a community that started out this way without having like a community level.
Mm-hmm.
But the second question about having something that started too broad and you want to go more niche, I think one of the reasons you have to understand why you want to go more niche, and usually it's because you're feeling some sort of like this is too broad, and there are going to be signals from your community, whether it be through your surveys, through your member meetings. You'll probably get a sense of like either people are not staying because they're not finding that thing that makes them feel like they belong, and we need to get a little level deeper, or people are not getting value. And so you'll want to just lead with that. Like, what are the things that my community needs? And can I go more niche? And yes, again, you'll lose people by going more niche, but it'll be way more valuable. People will be way more engaged, and you'll see those signals of a more engaged member happen as you become more niche. And I think throughout that process of going from broad to niche, just keep in mind, clear is kind. Just be really clear why you're making those decisions, what signals led you to that decision, and hopefully it's member-led, and you're not just changing your passion. Because if that's the case, maybe you should hand off this community and start a new one.
Hard-hitting advice, but I think it's probably apt. No, it's a great shout. And honestly, I've never actually worked, I think, in a community where you don't have a global level. That's a pretty
Yeah.
interesting concept where it's all sub-communities all the time. I don't know if you've got this number off the top of your head, but do you have like an approximation of how many members exist within multiples of those sub-communities, or is it pretty well defined where everyone just kind of slots into one?
You know what? We just launched the community less than a month ago. And
Okay.
so most of the community signals today are that someone has come in for a particular event or a particular group. But going forward, our hypothesis is that they belong to multiple groups. But I think I might be surprised to see, because there are a lot of in-person events. And so it's possible that someone who has the persona that likes to go to in-person events won't like to attend online events, and so they'll only be a part of their city community.
I ask because I've worked with other communities where, you do have these more niche subgroups, but there can be a level of overlap, say in a medical community where maybe you've got a heart health group, but you've also got a stroke survivors group. You have a heart attack survivors group. And how do all of these overlap and interplay where you're trying to make sure that you go to one group knowing exactly what you're going to get, minimizing the amount of overlap or ambiguity, and that can be hairy depending on
Yeah.
the subject, the concept of the community itself. But I think ultimately going back to your community members, getting that feedback, it's the best way to understand what they need, how they're using the platform, and really building around them. Um, that brings me to the end of our planned questions for now. So if we're open to it, I would love to dive into the Q&A because it has been really hard to follow while we've been having this conversation, and just see if there are any questions that we can tackle in these last 15 minutes we have here. Um, let me go through and team, if you see anything that's particularly speaking to you in terms of an interesting question, feel free to tackle it. But let's see, how do we know?
I
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mentioned a little bit about like how do you know what healthy looks like about Stripe community, but Sierra, I'd be interested. What does healthy look like for y'all at Blue Star?
Based on like active users or what healthy?
What is that definition for you? Like
Um,
it could be active users, but
Yeah, over the last couple years, we've had a few different goals as far as membership numbers that we needed to reach, groups that we wanted to create. And so, healthy for me is definitely the engaged user. That's really what I try to look at is, who's coming back weekly or at least, monthly, who's registering for events, who is sharing information. We try to, look at engagement, not necessarily just like who's commenting, but if someone does like one of the posts or share their own posts, there's different levels that we'll look at. But for me, definitely active users and how often they're coming back to join us and even just look. They can lurk all they want, but are they there or are they just, registering and never coming back? Because then we've lost something and we're definitely doing something wrong.
I love the way that that question kind of opened up where it's like, well, are we talking about active users? And so, are we talking about
are
active?
we talking about it? Yeah. I think what's interesting, the community, we have it's an application based community, but we also have a rule where you have to be active in 90-day period or we remove you. Wild.
Okay.
But activity for us is like you could like a post, like emoji react to a post, you could comment, you could make a new post. But one of our big main pointers in the community is we really want people to understand who's in the room with them. It's part of our mandate is to create psychological safety, and to be able to create psychological safety, you kind of have to know who's around you.
Yeah.
And so we've made a big emphasis on activity. And so for us, we actually like made a really hard stop at 90 days. If you haven't interacted in the community, we'll remove you. You can reapply, you can come back in, because we all have seasons of life where we're just not online. But I think like we know we denote health by if they are participating in the community.
Yeah, that's great.
It's such a an interesting thing when you've got people kind of, interacting in a space and then just going dark for maybe 90 days at a time and they reemerge. And I would love to understand, if you've had pretty significant bounce back rates in terms of, you know, you haven't been engaging, you're out of here, and then they resurface a year or two later and they say, I want back in, because it is a lot more impactful to go into a small community of actively engaged people than a well-populated ghost town, which is not the sort of welcoming community that you typically want to enter when you're talking about a niche environment. I saw am I getting there? Wish Me had a question as far as, how do you convince people to join and how do you really create a compelling value proposition? And I mean, I think it does largely go back to the feedback loop, but it's also maintaining that quality of community, right? And making sure that you do have the right people in place where when somebody lands, there are people there to welcome them, answer their questions, carry on the conversation in a way that feels natural and not stilted or forced. So I mean, I'm curious. I don't know if there are any other tidbits or piece of advice that you would have as far as, do we have any other modes of driving people into a niche community, or even finding potential community bases that we can kind of scrape for more people? Or is that really just the nature of being in the community space and kind of letting that flywheel turn?
Well, when starting from scratch, I think one of the things that you have to lean into is that it's going to probably be a little bit quiet for a minute. But I think like one of the things we trialed in TCC was we would start up a community, a channel that was a niche of the community overall, and then we would give it 90 days. And if it was not active, like if people did not come in after us talking about what value it provided, we closed it. Because people oftentimes will go have a gut reaction of like, well, we really need this, or I could see this being really valuable. And sure, but until we try it, we might not know. And so it's okay to try things and have them fail. And I think like as community professionals, that's something that we often have to deal with is the failure piece, and not let it be like failure in a negative way, but failure in a learning way. And so, yeah, just being cognizant that like, if you're not getting anybody coming in, and you are like having a marketing flywheel, if you will, or funnel, then maybe your community isn't solving a problem that needs to be solved. And so you should pivot to something different.
Nikki, you strike me as quite the community scientist. You've mentioned hypotheses and testing and experiments, and I think that is very much a part of the community management game. I would argue that before diving into any experiments or hypotheses, that it probably makes sense to have established benchmarks. Maybe that's the word for it, but really understanding what are we testing, what are the limits of this experiment. Like you said, 90 days, we're pulling the plug or we're not. Are there any other, I guess, piece of advice you would have around if you are testing a community concept, good barriers to put in place to make sure that, that experiment doesn't spin out of control, or that there's not an undefined end to that experiment?
I mean, it's just like you said, having the clear defined, what does this experiment look like? Having a time limit on it is always really helpful, because otherwise this could go on forever, and when do I check in? But also I think being really realistic about what does activity in 90 days look like? It's not going to be that there's going to be 50% of the community is going to hop into this niche community. And so what can I realistically expect to have happen? And what do I want as a business or as a professional association to get out of that? And so for us, it was like, if two people are in a channel chatting away consistently around this topic, I think that's valuable, because there are two people getting value out of this. If it becomes a ghost town for 90 days, maybe it's not necessary, and that conversation can happen in DMs instead. But I think like it's important to give it a try.
And is that 90-day, that policy, that cutoff, was that based on any sort of user behaviors that you observed? Was it more arbitrary? Was that itself kind of a hypothesis? I saw you had a question, Lori, as far as how that was set.
If you look at the makeup of the community member for TCC, it's a professional community in the senior levels of the profession. And a lot of times in senior levels of profession, you're actually working on a 90-day cadence. And so the reason why that signal is important is because at the end of your 90 days, your communities, like our community, will get quieter, because they're heads down in their work, working on stuff. But the hope would be that when you're kind of like have a little bit of time to breathe, you're like working through what I'm going to work on in the next quarter, you'll come into the community and talk about it. And so I can't really expect a senior leader to be actively in the community throughout like a month. Didn't make sense. And so we tested with 90 days at the start, and it worked. So we continued that way.
Awesome. So based it on what you had the hypothesis, it panned out.
Yep.
Sierra, I don't know if you have any similar kind of, hypotheses or anything that you work with on your end. I assume the military probably doesn't necessarily run on a financial quarter model, so probably a little more challenging to kind of map out, like, what is a reasonable level of engagement to expect over a given amount of time. But is there anything that you do on your end just to ensure that, you are kind of keeping the community clean, making sure that you do have the right people in place? Are there any hypotheses you're working on right now? I'd love to understand just kind of a.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. From the military perspective, timing can be different for everybody, frankly. We do try to do, quarterly check-ins just to ensure, like, hey, have you moved? Like, are you near one of our in-person locations now? Make sure your information's updated so that you can get all of the relevant events and resources that you need for where you are. I'll host different like virtual events throughout the year too, just to kind of give people the opportunity to come together, particularly for our families who aren't near an in-person location, because lots of families are spread all around the country, overseas, and so we still want them to be able to have that community even if they can't get to one of the in-person events. We don't really have a baseline for kicking people out. We try to live by kind of that 99-1% rule. Like 90% of people are going to be lurkers. They're not going to do much. 9%, might engage with a post. A lot more people tend to be registering for our events. I think a lot of people, come to engage in the activities that we have, the perks. We partner with different organizations to offer opportunities for families that they might not otherwise be able to partake in. And just really, that 1% of people who are engaging, who are sharing, pump them up, make sure they know we appreciate it and we're so glad you're here, and share with your friends and tell them to come too,
I know we've only got a couple minutes left here, but Sierra, I feel like that was a really good segue into maybe the last question we'll get around to on the Q&A right now. But it sounds like, when you're talking about like, hey, people are traveling, they can be spread pretty thin, they want to attend these events, they're looking for the connection. That can be tough. A lot of the time, community exists to supplement that, right? Where maybe you can't always be in the same room as these people, but you still do want to have that human element. And there's a question that came through as far as how do you decide what is automated and what stays human? Blue Star Families is huge. You probably can't be manually responding to every single thing that comes through, but you do still want it to have that human element. You want it to feel like it's alive, like it's welcoming, like it understands the people who are in the community. So, question for everybody, but what are our rules of thumb in terms of really saying, hey, this is something I'm comfortable automating versus this really needs a human touch, and this is something that we can't compromise on?
I know for us, like, I try to respond to everybody, personally within 24 hours. That's kind of our feedback loop.
Lofty goal.
We do have, some security levels in there just to make sure things aren't missed that are of significant value. I did really appreciate when Hivebrite made the posting availability to be able to schedule that. That makes it nice. That's one of those automations that are really, thank you, so glad to have this, because it just helps like to not have to be in on a Sunday to add this post or something. But I think ensuring that you have someone from the team who is there to kind of respond to people on a personal level if they are maybe struggling with something, if they're looking for a particular resource, if they just moved and they don't know how to get connected. It is important to have that personal touch, to know that there is a human here. Like, we care, we want to hear what you're going through, we want to support you, and we want to help you thrive no matter where you are. And so that's something that, you can't automate. You need to, have a team available who's going to be ready and willing to support and show up.
You're still really hands-on, and even when it comes to using like AI, you're not necessarily having clawed right to the community, but just more scheduling, more quality of life. How do we kind of streamline the admin experience while still giving you that? That makes a lot of
Still
sense.
being supportive. Yep.
And Nikki, how about yourself? Is there anything that you're automating in the community, or do you have any general thoughts on, in this world of AI, kind of how we strike that balance?
Yeah, I have this rule for my own personal self where I will automate something that I would do if I had the time to do it. So, for example, everybody who goes into the community gets a welcome message from an individual, and that is automated. But the message is reviewed every 90 days. 90 is a beautiful number in our community, to make sure we're still saying the thing that we would want to say if we were welcoming a member immediately. And then but we will reply as ourselves if someone replies back. And so I think like taking the burden off of myself of like, I need to message someone within 5 minutes of them getting in the community. Like, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so in order to create a good experience for everyone, I automate that first message. And I think like there are moments like that you can automate, like scheduling posts, like an automated first message. But there's always going to be that thing that you have to do yourself afterwards, and should do yourself.
Maybe in the future we can just have robots running it all, but for now.
Robots talking to robots.
On that note, if anyone on the call isn't aware yet, in the Hivebrite community, we do actually have I think it's an open beta right now for our new automations tool coming out. So, if you are looking for more ways to kind of streamline that experience, how do I take a little bit more off my plate while still maintaining that human touch? That could be a cool tool to keep in your back pocket and see if there are some opportunities for streamlining things there. But I do not want to go down that rabbit hole because I'm looking at the clock right now and we are at the top of the hour. So I want to be respectful of that. First off, Sierra, Nikki, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. It was awesome to chat with you, and your insights, your expertise, they're so appreciated. So thank you, and looking forward to doing this again soon. To our audience, we'll be sharing a recording of this webinar by email, so stay tuned for that. If you do have any follow-up questions, if your question didn't get answered in the Q&A today, please feel free to hit reply on that email. Let us know. Chime in the Hivebrite community. We'd love to hear from you, and even if we didn't have a chance to get to your question today, we certainly want to get to it tomorrow. We're also going to send a survey link out, so I think that actually might be in the chat right now. Would very much appreciate if you could take a minute to give us your feedback on the webinar today. We'd love to hear back from you and make sure that the next one is doubly as informative. With that said, we are a minute over time, so thank you again. Appreciate everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Take care.